I'm Zachary Ginsberg. I'm going to be doing the public forum topic analysis for Champions Briefs for February. The topic for this month is Resolve the United States should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So in this video, throughout the course of it, I'm going to start off with just a backgrounder on the topic, key information that I think is important to know going into debating it. Second of all, I'm going to go over the key tournaments this month, or i.e. I'm going to go over specifically the key tournament, which is Harvard. And then we're going to talk a little about strategy and weighing. And finally, we're going to go and delve into possible argumentation you could be doing for either side of the topic. But it's also important to notice that this is a short video. I can only get through so much. And I highly advise you check out the Champions Brief itself with far more analysis in the 3 topic analyses there that are written, and then multiple different argument options written up throughout the brief with evidence already found for you by some of the best debaters out there. So with that said, let's start off with a little bit of a backgrounder on this topic in particular. So you might be wondering, why all of a sudden are we discussing whether or not the United States should end arms sales to Saudi Arabia? We've been doing it for years and years. We've had a relationship with Saudi Arabia for a very long time, basically a transactional relationship whereby they give us oil and we give them arms because each of us specialize in each of those particular industries. But why is it coming up now? Saudi Arabia has done lots of bad stuff in the past in which we have not threatened to take away our arms sales, but now we're seeing actual calls from within Congress to take action. This is because recently we've seen a new leader come to rise in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman is the new leader. He's basically handpicked by the United States through a signaling process that we used to show that we would favor him above the alternatives. From the outset, it looked like MBS was going to be a particularly good leader. He is very progressive for Saudi Arabian standards, fighting for things like women's rights and trying to protect disadvantaged groups in Saudi Arabia, which is much better than anything that we've seen from past administrations. However, recently, he's been doing a few things that the United States has not been a fan of. For one thing, he killed the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and he's also recently been instituting blockades in Yemen, blocking food from entering Houthi-dominated areas, which is the rebel group in the Yemeni civil war. This has led to the deaths of thousands because the people have been unable to get food, and mainly because they have no ability to make food within Yemen itself because of how war-torn it is. So more information is definitely advisable about the specific relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and also recent tensions, but that's just the basics for right now. The other area of the topic that is really important to understand is what's going on actually in Yemen, because this is a huge turning point here, and it's probably where most of the biggest impact on the topic are going to come from. So in Yemen, there's currently a civil war between the Houthi faction, which is a Shia-dominated group, and the government, which is a Sunni-dominated government. A while ago, Iran got involved and started supporting the Houthi rebels to try and overthrow the Sunni regime. And now, in response to that, Saudi Arabia has been engaging in a proxy war whereby they've been giving aid to the leaders of Yemen who are Sunni. So they align with each other on their branch of Islam, and so they're fighting it out in the battlefields of Yemen. Up to this point, over 70,000 people have died in the conflict alone, with another 13 million people throughout Yemen facing mass starvation because of the famine that's been going on because of the conflict. So clearly, there's something really wrong going on here. The UN has called this possibly the worst famine we've seen in 100 years. And there have been some pretty bad famines within the past 100 years in Somalia and East Africa, and yet they're calling this one the worst. So it's a very delicate situation. It's very challenging because the United States is currently selling arms to Saudi Arabia, whereby we are basically enabling Saudi Arabia to kill people and drop bombs throughout Yemen. But the topic is not so clear-cut. There is an opposing side here, and we're going to go into how you can try to approach this from either side of the topic. So, before we do that, though, I just want to make a brief note about preparing for the major tournament this month, which is Harvard. It's the biggest tournament of the year. It has normally over or around 400 different teams that are competing. And this means that there's not only a wide array of competition and a wide array of judges, but it also means that it's going to be competitive just to break at this tournament. With over or around 400 teams, many teams that go 4-2 won't even be able to break. So it's important to prepare your cases such that you'll be able to be competitive right at the outset of debating. I know a lot of times what teams can do is just get their practice in the first few rounds of a tournament, but at Harvard that's not necessarily possible because of how competitive the pool is. The other thing I'll say is that a lot of coaches might advise that you try to have multiple different cases because of the wide array of competition and different types of judges you may have. I would argue the opposite. You should probably have one strategy that works for many different camps and you can use and get very, very good at over the course of the tournament, because at a tournament like Harvard where every round matters, having your own strategy down pat and being able to actually execute is far more important than having an idea that you potentially could argue for, but you don't have enough practice with, and then fail to actually make ends meet when you get into the round. So I highly advise a highly practiced case of concrete ideas, rather than many to try and appeal to a wide array of different audiences. So let's talk about this topic in particular and how this strategy is probably going to go down. So we basically see two types of arguments. I could basically see two types of arguments that are going to go on here. One has to do with the short-term effects on the Yemeni civil war itself, and then the second category of arguments has to do with possible long-term harms or long-term benefits for the entire region of the Middle East or Saudi Arabia's involvement with the United States altogether going forward. So we have short-term harms that are punchy and easy to weigh, and long-term harms which are more systematic. For the pro, we're primarily going to see the short-term impact because there's primarily going to be arguments about taking arms away that kill people right now. And then the con, we're probably going to be seeing more of the long-term impacts because of the implications that pulling away support might have for how Saudi Arabia views the United States as a partner. Another really important thing to do when thinking about this topic is to consider the alternative of everything that's going on. This happens a lot in international relations topics, and especially ones that have to do with conflict. Because even if it's true that United States support might be bad, right? The con can perfectly argue that United States support itself is bad, and all of the con's arguments are correct, and all the pros' arguments are correct. However, if the alternative is worse, then it's still on balance better to keep with what the United States is doing. So these are just some broad ideas to keep in mind when we're going throughout the specifics of each side, but let's get into the specifics of each side. So starting with the pro. The easiest argument to make on the pro is actually a very, very good argument. This is pretty rarely the case, but on this topic it is. So the classic argument you might want to make is that when the United States pulls away arms sales, well then Saudi Arabia will have less of a capability to perpetuate the problems that they're creating in Yemen, right? And it's not enough, and my advice for this type of argument is that it's not enough to simply say, oh, Saudi Arabia goes in and they bomb people and they kill people, because the impacts are far greater than just that. You can flesh it out in a way with nuance such that it not only perceptually matters more with appeal to emotion, but also you can make logical arguments about the long term here as well and outweigh the con on their own weighing mechanisms of the long term and systematic harms, right? So let's go over a few examples of this. Saudi Arabia intentionally often bombs aid workers when they're trying to deliver aid to people in Yemen, right? This could have implications not only for right now, making sure that people don't get food, but also for the long-term perception of safety in the region for aid organizations to be able to go in. It doesn't just affect people in this moment, but possibly in the future. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia often bombs key roads and pieces of infrastructure, schools, hospitals, food supply centers, etc., right? This not only damns people in Yemen right now by preventing them from getting food and medical care, but it also prevents development in Yemen later down the road. Once you entirely bomb infrastructure, basically society has to start from scratch again, because that's where a lot of money from like the startup of a civilization goes in, because those are the main roots and the main sorts of mechanisms that a society needs to use in order to function. They need to be able to deliver food, they need to be able to have commerce, and you can't do that without buildings, and you can't do that without basic things like supermarkets and roads. Once that goes away, you're basically resetting civilization in Yemen for quite a long period of time, right? So it's important to consider that the further that Saudi Arabia goes in terrorizing Yemen, the worse and the worse it gets, not only right now, but into the long term as well, for these reasons. So that's a certain way that you can try to flesh out the actual impact on that argument. But there's even more arguments on this side as well. I think it's important to argue that when the United States takes away weapons, we then get more leverage over Saudi Arabia, which could possibly make them change their course of action in other ways as well that are not directly affected by us giving them weapons and them using them. For example, if we take, right now, Saudi Arabia kind of sees the United States as someone that they can depend on. They can always have a steady flow of cash coming in for oil and weapons coming in for fighting. But when we show that we're willing to step away from them when they do wrong things, well, then we get the upper hand, and it's possible to hold that over their heads in negotiation processes. What does this mean? It means that we could get them to be more of a viable partner with fighting terrorism in general in the region. It means that we can use the leverage in order to get them to stop the blockade that's currently threatening millions of people in Yemen by denying them food, right? We can access other types of actions that Saudi Arabia is doing that are pretty bad, other than just them using our weapons. Now, I think it's important to consider that because these arguments are so simple, they're going to be overburdened with many, many responses from the Khan. The Khan, I can foresee one major response, and it's probably even going to be the crux of many negative cases, which is that some other country, which is worse than the United States, might step in if we don't provide them with weapons, and that's bad because these other countries like China and Russia don't have the same concerns for human rights that we do, and even if it's bad what we're doing, when it's under their control, it would be even worse. I think that there's a few easy ways that you can respond to this response. So first, I think you can say that the United States is the only country really, or that has enough of an interest in order to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. The United States is known for wanting to have a strong presence in the Middle East. It gives us a lot of soft power that other countries don't have, and that's basic, and that's how we see ourselves. Whereas other countries don't necessarily see themselves in the same way. They don't necessarily need to have the same kind of commitment to the Middle East that we do. Right? This, not only that, but we also buy more oil from Saudi Arabia than other countries do, than Russia and than China do. So they have less on the line and less of an incentive to keep Saudi Arabia happy. Furthermore, it might even be damaging to the international perception of Russia and China if they get involved with Saudi Arabia, because of how bad Saudi Arabia currently looks in the news after the killing of Khashoggi, and especially now after the blockading of Yemen and basically causing this famine. Right? They might not necessarily want to get involved there. But then you can even go a layer deeper and say that even if it's true that other countries have the willingness to go in and support Yemen in the absence of American support, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be able to give as much support or as deadly support as the United States can provide. For example, the United States has not only a bigger military than the next 10 countries combined, if not more, but we also have just more money in our government, which means that we are able to support the regime in Saudi Arabia to a much larger extent than any other country possibly could. So getting rid of us would be particularly good, even if it's true that someone else might replace us. It's still better than the alternative. So now moving on to the cons. So as we just went over, you can easily respond to those responses and say, no, it actually is true that Russia and China or other authoritarian regimes with large militaries have an incentive to get involved in the area, i.e. they want to outcompete the United States, right? And this makes a lot of sense, especially as Russia and China are becoming larger threats on the international scene and are kind of capitalizing on the United States' mistakes. They have an incentive to then go in here and fill the void when one is created when we stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Also, you can easily respond to the stuff about how they don't have the ability to meet the same weapon supplies as the United States, because it's not as if the United States is giving up our entire military to Saudi Arabia. We're giving up some things to Saudi Arabia, which Russia and China certainly could provide. We give them small arms. We give them, we refuel their planes. We give them bombs. These are things that are perfectly within the capacity of Russia and China. Even if they don't have as big of a military as us, they can still possibly give the aid that we provide. Plus, it's also true that Saudi Arabia already has a lot of military support coming from these other countries, and already has a lot of military supplies in their reserves that they can already use. So they don't even necessarily need the added benefit of the United States. They can still perfectly act without us, right? But also on the con, you don't even necessarily have to argue that other countries wouldn't get involved. You could say that it's true that when the United States stops providing weapons to Saudi Arabia, they stop getting involved in Yemen. You can concede to all of the pros' arguments and still win the round. How? Because you can make, like I was talking about in the framing, in the strategy part of the video, you can make long-term arguments about how support from withdrawing support from the United States will piss off Saudi Arabia and make them angry towards us, so that they're less likely to cooperate with us on future issues that may matter more than what's currently going on in Yemen. For example, Saudi Arabia is a vital partner in the Middle East for counter-terrorism intelligence and for counter-terrorism activities. They help all the time with fighting ISIL and Al-Qaeda, so it's important that we have them as a partner in that regard. Also, and this is really important because it's not as if we could just get this information on our own. Having a vital partner in the Middle East is crucial because solving terrorism often depends more on intelligence than it does on manpower. And this is clearly the case because if it depended on manpower, the United States would definitely have defeated ISIS by now, but we haven't, right? Because you can't just bomb the entire Middle East and then hope that to work. You have to know where terrorists are. They often hide within civilian areas with families. They often hide within deserts and mountains and places that we don't necessarily have as good surveillance on. So it's important to have on-the-ground information, especially when combating terrorism. So if we ever want a chance in winning the war on terror, we need Saudi Arabia on our side. So this is compelling weighing that you can do to outweigh the seemingly large impacts of causing problems within the Yemeni civil war, right? There's also weighing to be done on, the threat of Iran. By having a stronger Saudi Arabia, we can use that as a counterweight to Russia's backing of Iran and to make sure that Iran doesn't necessarily get too powerful and cause problems if they possibly develop a nuclear weapon. And that there's easy weighing to be done there about how a nuclear apocalypse will destroy the entire world, and any chance of that happening is far more important even than the high death toll that's going on currently in Yemen. We need to make sure that we have the strong power to prevent the worst case scenario from occurring. So there's those two strategies for either side. It's important to be able to go toe-to-toe on either, but I also suggest that you strongly specialize in one of these on either side, because if you're on the pro and you're kind of bending yourself to the con strategy, even if you're winning on their weighing, perceptually from the judge's perspective, it still looks like you're bending to the con. It still looks like you're giving them the ground of the debate. So it's important to have a clear stance that is unique in the round in order to allow you to stand out from the other team and to be winning on that through strong and compelling weighing. For other arguments to possibly run on this topic, I highly suggest, again, that you check out the Champion's Brief. Written there are many different amazing arguments by some of the best debaters of the past, already written with evidence that can give you lots of ideas for how to write your own cases and be successful come February. Good luck and happy debating.